now hand over to Sylvia, who's going to introduce our this evening's lecturer, Liz McIntyre, or Lisa McIntyre. Sylvia, are you there?
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I am. Okay. Yes.
I'll hand over to you. Thanks. Okay.
I know several people on the screen tonight, but for those who don't know me, I'm Sylvia Johnson, and I'm a trustee of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust, and I'm also chair of the grant committee. So as Tom's just mentioned, we're delighted to be joined by Lisa McIntyre tonight, who will be talking about the Bishop's Palaces of England. Lisa's worked for Alan Baxter as a heritage consultant, and also for the Church Buildings Council for the Church of England, where I first met her many years ago. When I retired as the DAC Secretary for the Diocese of Leeds in 2017, I was delighted when Lisa was appointed, and she made the move from London to Leeds. She's doing a great job with her team, which is an ever-expanding team of church building officers, and also to do with pastoral reorganisation. And with a portfolio of 656 churches in the Diocese of Leeds, there's never a dull moment, I know. So she's going to explore the rise and fall of the palace and the bishops who inhabited them. And now hand over to her to begin. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or raise your hand after the talk, and we can hopefully take a few questions for about 10 minutes so that we end roughly around 8 p.m. Lisa.
Thank you very much. And yeah, Sylvia is big footsteps to follow in the work that I'm doing. But thank you for inviting me along this evening. If anyone was signing in, they might have heard Sylvia mention that I gave a similar lecture to this a few years ago for the Churches Conservation Trust. And I thought that I might be able to pull that out and dust it off and just do it again. But I decided I wanted to try and focus in on Yorkshire as much as possible, and failing that, the North. And my previous lecture did have a bit more of a Southern focus. So I do cover bits of the South, but I have tried to kind of tailor this a bit more to talk about Yorkshire and the Bishop's Palaces that exist and existed in the county. And so I've given this for people who are interested in churches before. And I do hope that even though I'm not talking about churches, I'm talking about the Church of England and the development of the Church of England. And anyone who's interested in churches, I hope, will be interested in the parallels with church architecture as well, and how the architecture has developed over time in churches in the same way that it has in bishops' palaces. So although it's not church specific, it is the Church of England. So if you're interested in churches and the history of the church, then hopefully you will take something away of interest this evening. So I will begin screen sharing. It worked a moment ago, and I hope it works again now. Yes, so I will start, if I can, with a quote. This is taken from a letter written by the nephew of the Archbishop, Thomas Herring, when he was staying at Bishopthorpe Palace in 1743. So he wrote, "I am at present under the hospitable roof of an archbishop, of which I can send you no regular account, for it was built at a time of day when men paid more attention to convenience than to uniformity, and therefore it would be in vain to attempt an exact description of it. The rooms are very large and furnished in character, and that apartment where I now sit to write is ornamented with the adventures of Samson, curiously wrought in old tapestry, the work, perhaps, of some religious dame. In one of the bedchambers on each side of the chimney, there are 2 cherubims weeping most bitterly." And he goes on to end, "Upon the whole, it is a most agreeable house, and pleases me better than if it had been designed by Lord Burlington or any other genius of that age." I start with that because I think it's a kind of really beautiful description of how characterful these buildings are, and how they're not uniform. They've developed over the centuries, and they encapsulate different periods of art and architecture. And they are, first and foremost, they were built as residences. So he talks quite lovingly of what a characterful and comfortable place it is. So I will start by just saying a little bit about the bishops and the medieval bishops. So as today, they were the most senior clergy of the church. They had a role in a pastoral role and in worship and mission, and they had oversight of the clergy, supporting them, but also holding them to account and overseeing the courts of the church. They had oversight of the monasteries as well. They had oversight of the management of the lands which were owned by the diocese and the income that came in from them. So in the respects of the oversight of the clergy and all that is similar to today, but the role differed a fair amount because of the central role that the church had in society. So they were much more influential, much more political. They were usually appointed because they had close connections with the crown, and part of what they did, they often had roles around Parliament and close connections with the crown. And this even included military service, as royalty went to war in those days, so did the bishops. An example of this kind of close connection with the crown is Archbishop Walter de Grey, who established Bishopthorpe Palace in the 13th century. He was one of the advisors to King John present at Readymead for the signing of Magna Carta. So the role of the bishops, which required oversight of various aspects of the running of the diocese and the clergy, meant that they had to move around quite a lot in order to visit all corners of the diocese. So in a time where transport was less easy, they had different accommodation in different parts of the diocese. In addition to that, they also had to go down to London to attend Parliament frequently and the royal courts. So there were numerous houses for each diocese. There was usually one in the cathedral city and then scattered about the diocese, and then occasional outliers as well. In terms of the London residences, the one that still survives today is Lambeth Palace, which is the London residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who also has a residence in Canterbury itself. It's a great, it's an amazing building, and it's amazing that it survives today. And I think it's great that it kind of really illustrates this close connection of the church and state, because it lies directly across the Thames from the Houses of Parliament. So the Archbishop of York had a palace in a residence in London as well. That's now gone, but it's indicative of how grand a structure that would have been, because it was borrowed for use by Edward I when the royal palace at Westminster was burnt down. But moving on from the London palaces, the diocesan ones would have varied in number depending on the diocese and the wealth of the diocese. So the wealth distribution of the diocese was not even. Some dioceses owned a lot more land than others, and some were larger, some were smaller. And in addition to the money of the diocese, the palaces and the number and their grandeur were also influenced by the wealth of individual bishops. So bishops would put their own money into them as well. And they often came from wealthy families because they had close connections with the crown. They were obviously going to be influential and important people. For the Archbishops of York, there's been around 17 identified residences, including his London one, and then some which lie outside of Yorkshire. These include one in Southwell in Nottinghamshire, which used to be within the Diocese of York, but then also one in Hexham, which was never in the Diocese of York. It used to be in the Diocese of Durham. The bishops of Durham are worth mentioning, speaking of Durham, because they were particularly powerful and wealthy. So Durham had its own jurisdiction and was quite autonomous from the crown. So you may have heard the term the Prince Bishops of Durham. This was because they had powers in excess of the other bishops. They could raise armies, they could tax the population, they had their own version of the Domesday Book to enable that, and they had powers over the secular courts as well as the church courts. So the bishops had multiple residences. Usually one came out as a favorite from all the ones that they had available. And this was often not the one based in the city. There usually was one in the city, in the cathedral city, but it usually wasn't preferred because the bishop kind of liked to stay out of the business of the cathedral where he could, because they were run by the dean and chapter. But he wanted somewhere where he could easily access the cathedral when he needed to. So a really good example of this is at York. So there did used to be a bishop's palace immediately to the north of York Minster. Most of it is now gone today. You can see on this plan the minster stands there in the centre, and then up in the top right-hand corner, number 7 is one of the remaining buildings, the only remaining full building, which used to be the chapel
Out
of
of
the
it.
bishops. And then there's a little bit of arcade remaining as well. And then some of the
Sorry,
dotted buildings.
Lisa, could I just interrupt a moment?
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you mean to move the slides on? Because we're still on number 1.
Are they not moving? Oh,
No,
they're-
but you need
No.
to go. Sorry, Lisa, you need to go
Yeah.
up slideshow. You're in home at the moment. Go to slideshow and start
Oh.
there and say start from there.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Thank you.
Go
Slideshow.
to slideshow at the top
Yep.
and then start from here. And that
From
it'll
beginning.
save having the thing at the side.
Okay, let's try again. Can you see it now?
No,
Ah.
I think you just need to share your screen again.
yeah, I think so.
Alright. Okay. Share. From beginning.
I'll go to slideshow.
Is that working?
No, but press on slideshow, which is underlined.
Yeah, I got slideshow and then from the
Start
beginning.
from the beginning.
Yeah, I've done that.
No, you should have got rid of these.
Is it working now? Is that scrolling?
Press to from the beginning. Stream left-hand side
Yeah,
screen.
I have done that. I have done
No,
that.
from the beginning, that's it.
Yeah.
You'll get rid of the pictures then.
Yeah.
No,
If you just
Yeah.
click on number 2 and see if the second one
you do
comes up.
from the current slide then.
There
Go
you
to the
go.
next one.
From the current slide. Have you got that?
Yeah.
No,
Is
it's
it moving
still,
now?
no, it's, we should get these side pictures. Side slide, I know.
What do we do?
So are you seeing the plan of York
Is it
now?
custom
Well,
slideshow?
That'll do, that'll do. Yeah, just keep on with that then, but
Oh, can you see the plan of York?
We're on slide number
Yes.
2 at the minute.
yeah,
Slide 2 at the minute.
yeah.
It's not moving.
But-
It's it's a custom slideshow.
Yeah,
It's not
possibly.
working. That doesn't seem right. I'm
Go
going
back-
from current slide.
Yeah. Go to current slide again, just see.
Yeah. So I'm
Now
just going to have to.
Now
Double
we're on
click it.
3.
Just click it.
Yeah, double click that.
So are you seeing York now?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yes. Okay. Oh dear. All right. So I don't know what's going on there, but yeah, you got York Minster there in the middle. And then various buildings, so the ones that are hatched to exist,
is.
and you've got remnants of the Archbishop's Palace there, and then the ones that are dotted are some of the buildings that have been identified but have now gone. And this includes a prison, which would have related to his judicial role. Right. So
How can I
So-
get off?
are you seeing, if I scroll on now to, there's the image of the former chapel.
No, at the minute we're still on the. Oh yes, it's moved on now. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, maybe if I just don't show it as a slideshow and you'll just have to see the banner down the side. That might be the best way to do it. So I'm thrown by that. Anyway, let's try again. So yes, this is one remnant of the York Palace that remains, and the York Palace was established in the just let me find where I got to, in the mid-12th century, and it carried on. It was changed over the centuries, but by the mid-16th century, its destruction began when the Archbishop removed the lead from the ceiling in order to fund an estate for his son. And from there, it just went into further decay, and was sold on to private ownership, but then later returned to the chapter of the Minster. But even before the destruction of it began, really, Bishop Thorpe took over as the preferred resident, one of the preferred residents of the Archbishops of York. Are you seeing Bishop Thorpe now?
Yes, we are, thanks.
Yes, excellent. So this is 3 miles south of York, and it lies on the River Ouse. So there used to be an entrance from the river up into the palace. So it was all about ease of travel. So this was in close proximity to the cathedral city, which was helpful. This was acquired by Bishop Walter de Grey in the mid-13th century when he took the manor over from Kirkstall Abbey and built the first bit of the palace, which you can't see in this view because there's been the development since then. But that development over the centuries kind of shows that it was a popular, that how it became the favoured residence. Money kept being put into it over the centuries. The Archbishop made the clever move of actually vesting the ownership of the manor in the Dean and Chapter of the cathedral. And he did this with the right for the bishop to reside there. And he did this because there was a practice at the time where the crown would sometimes keep a diocese vacant deliberately so they could get the money and income from the manor. So he made a clever move, so that didn't happen there. So this, this was, the first buildings were in the mid-13th century, and then the size of it was basically doubled 2 centuries later, and then in the 18th century refronted and expanded again. Another popular, one of the favoured residences in the medieval period was at Carwood. This is now reduced to a few buildings, and you can see the map there on the left-hand side with the gatehouse and the Brook Range. They're the bit that survive, but there's been archaeology and other investigations to get a sense of some of the buildings that did exist there, which are lettered, and then the medieval gardens and orchard. So it's a substantial site, and it was clearly a key residence of the Archbishops of York, particularly during the 14th century, because there are several archbishops noted as dying there, so obviously residing there as well. One archbishop is actually buried in the local church at Carwood, but that was George Montaigne. But that was more to do with the fact that he was actually born in Carwood, but it's said that he came from a very poor family and he was inspired seeing Carwood Castle to one day get to be Archbishop of York, but he did so for a very, very brief period, dying soon after he was appointed. That is his memorial that is in the church at Carwood. So the Carwood was hosted numerous royal visits, and it was there that Cardinal Wolsey was arrested on high treason as well. So it has quite a colourful history. You can see in the top of that map as well that it was also located on the River Ouse for that ease of transport and access. It was established, it was in the ownership of the bishops by the 10th century, and then developed, the first major program of building was 13th century, and then developed on a few other occasions over the centuries. Elsewhere in the north, a good example of the city and other palaces juxtaposition is at Durham. So Durham Castle was established in the Norman period and actually continued as a bishop's residence, one of the bishop's residences, all the way through until the mid-19th century. But really the favoured palace of the bishops of Durham became Bishop Auckland, which is shown here in a sketch. Once again, you see this pattern of it being located on a river not too far from the cathedral city. You can see at the bottom of this engraving a tributary of the River Wear, which runs through Durham, encircling the site. So this was developed really from the mid-12th century onwards. And there's a photograph of it as well. This also occurred down south. This is Worcester, the Archbishop's Palace in Worcester, which is located right alongside the cathedral. Again, it continued in use as a residence of the bishop, but really the favoured one was at Hartlebury, again on a river, again close by. So that's a bit about the locations of the bishop's palaces. a bit more on their architecture and their features. So the bishops were powerful men, they were on par with nobility. In many ways, the distinction between the houses of nobility and the houses of bishops are very few. They kind of developed in the same ways. But one feature which there is some distinction is perhaps unsurprisingly around the chapels of the bishops' palaces. So, of course, a man of God is going to have somewhere to worship. The nobility would have done so as well, but they were particularly prominent features in the bishops' palaces. And there was a tendency in the early medieval period, especially for these to be located on the first floor with a vaulted undercroft below. It's not been established from records how the different spaces were used in these kind of two-story chapels, but it's thought that it was probably the bishop and his kind of inner circle had made use of one chapel, and then the rest of the household could worship separately in the other chapel underneath. And there's one 19th century historian reflected on the 13th century chapel at Bishop Thorpe, saying that consecration extended from the earth to the sky. And so the existence of bedrooms above or a larder below the chapel would have been seen as a desecration. So this sacred space across all levels of the building was set aside in the bishop's palaces. So this is the chapel, the upper story of the chapel at Bishop Thorpe, which can be seen here. Some other examples, really, really astonishingly beautiful. I'm a big fan of Norman, and this is the Norman undercroft at Durham Castle, which still survives. And then above that, you have the later chapel, which is decked out in 17th century woodwork, and which some of it actually came from Bishop Auckland. And other examples, so surviving is the chapel from York Castle, though that has now been repurposed as a library for the Minster, but you can see the interior and the windows there. It's also believed that there was a two-story chapel at a manor house in Otley, and none of which remains today, but stood at the north side end of town. So archaeology has revealed that there would have been a two-story chapel there with an apse. That manor house was in frequent use during the 13th century and restored several times over the years. So it was out of use and standing just as ruins. In 1702, the Leeds historian Ralph Throsby described seeing the ruins of the Archbishop's Palace there. At Auckland Castle, there was also a two-story chapel originally. It no longer exists, but archaeological investigations recently have shown the size of it. So the walls were 1.5 meters thick. There were large towers flanking the entrance, buttresses and internal columns. It would have been the largest structure at the castle, around 12 meters wide and 40 meters long, so indicating how important the chapels were in these buildings. I'll run through a few southern examples as well, just to drive home the point of the double-story chapels. So at this is at Worcester, where the first floor chapel exists there, originally 13th century and altered a couple of times over the centuries. And then at Wolvesey, you've got the first floor chapel again. This is thought to date to the mid-15th century, but it stands on the site, the foundations of a Norman chapel, which would have also been of 2 stories. They weren't all 2 stories, though. There are some significant examples of single-story chapels, including one at Wells, which dates to the late 13th century and is particularly noted as a really exemplar example of the decorated style. The chapel at Bishop Thorpe is also a very notable single-story structure, but that dates to the medieval period originally, but it wasn't originally a chapel, and I'll come on to that later. Another key part of the buildings would have been the Great Hall. because the bishops had to host nobility, they had to host royalty, and they needed somewhere to do that. Like the chapels, these were often over 2 stories in the earliest period. And then in subsequent development of the palaces, they were often superseded by a single story kind of grand lofty hall, which would be often built at right angles to the original buildings. Kind of in this process that kind of the castle started being enclosed a bit more, and there started to be a distinction between the private bits and the state bits as society kind of changed and bishops wanted a bit more of their own space. So Bishopthorpe Hall is an example of 1 over 2 stories, but I'll come on to pictures of that later because it doesn't look particularly medieval, even though it was originally 13th century. But there was also a 2-story hall at Carwood, which can be seen here. And this was built in between in the early 1400s. Now it's gutted in the interior. It's owned by the Landmark Trust, and you can stay in the gatehouse bit of that, but they've basically re-roofed it just to prevent further deterioration, but nothing survives inside effectively. So the halls hosted banquets, but they also served other functions. At Bishopthorpe, there was a peace treaty signed between England and Scotland in 1323, when the bishop got back from fighting against the Scots. Less welcome for the archbishops was when Richard Scrope in 1405 was taken on to Bishopthorpe Great Hall after being imprisoned at Pontefract Castle and tried for treason because he fought against Henry IV in the Great Northern Uprising. A couple of examples just to kind of illustrate the interior of some medieval double-storied halls. Here's one at Worcester. We're back there again from the 13th century. And Wells, there you can see that the undercroft in particular on the left-hand side. You can see the medieval structure of the building. Wells is also a good example for illustrating the point of where a double-story hall was superseded by a single-story hall. So in this picture, you can see on the left-hand side is the original double-storied hall, then the chapel in the middle, and then the ruins of what became the Great Hall, which was a single-story structure. There's also a very fine example of a single-story lofty hall at Durham Castle, which was built by under Bishop Anthony Beck in the early 14th century. Sir Walter Scott wrote about a feast that he was present at in 1827 of it, and he's described the old baronial hall, impressive in its rude antiquity. He talked about the bright moon streaming in through the old Gothic windows. He talked about the spears, banners, and armor intermixed with pictures of old bishops. He said the whole had a singular mixture of baronial pomp with the grave and more chastened dignity of prelacy. And there is also an example of a single-story hall at Hartlebury from the 15th century. So to accommodate all this hospitality giving and the general running of the household, the bishops' palaces would have also had to have functional buildings, of course. At Carwood, it's described that there was a pantry, a spicery, livery, plate room, kitchen, brewhouse, bakehouse, butlery, and stables. Most of these more functional buildings do not survive because they obviously got upgraded and modernized. You don't necessarily want a medieval kitchen when you're trying to prepare modern meals. However, at Chichester down south, the original kitchen does survive and can be seen there on the right-hand side, with just a general view of the palace on the left-hand side, showing its close proximity to the cathedral in that instance. At Bishopthorpe, the stables are described. Now, anyone looking at this will probably recognize this is not a medieval building, but there were earlier stables on the site, and this just kind of shows kind of scale of the functional buildings that the palaces included over the centuries. There was also a similar 18th century brew house at Bishopthorpe, which replaced the earlier brew house as well. The bishops' palaces would have had productive grounds and gardens for the supply of foods. Bishopthorpe describes a sheepfold, a wood, a fish pond, and a watermill. The archbishops also had a site at Bishop Barton to the west of Beverley, which featured fish ponds. And this was despite it being located on an area of chalk, which would have meant the expensive process of puddling or lining out the chalk. So again, the bishop probably didn't need fish, but it kind of showed his wealth to be able to have fish ponds. Deer parks were also connected with many of the bishops' palaces. So this is the deer shelter at Bishop Auckland. Again, this is a later building. It dates to the 18th century, but it's indicative of the prominence of hunting to the manor throughout centuries. So there was a herd of wild cattle at the deer park until the 17th century, and there's records of successive restocking of the park over the centuries. For the Archbishop of York, Carwood and Scrooby, which is in Nottinghamshire, both had deer parks. And there's one historian who described an Archbishop, Thomas Savage, who was in post for the first years of the 16th century, as being entirely neglectful of his duties, generally occupied either at court or when in the country by hunting, a pastime of which he was immoderately fond. And he is described as having spent a great deal of money on Carwood and Scrooby precisely because they were his favourite locations for hunting. Other buildings on site would have been for the bishop's judicial role. So they would have included places for holding court and sometimes included prisons as well. This was particularly important and relevant at Durham, where there was the secular courts as well as the ecclesiastical courts. And buildings hosting these functions still survive in the cathedral precincts on the on the castle precincts on the cathedral green to this day. They stand outside the walls of the castle. There's also records of courts being held at a great hall at the Manor of Beverley in 1444, and it's assumed there was a jail there. So there's no traces of this manor house anymore, but it was in the ownership of the archbishops by at least 1280, which was the first documentary records. And there were substantial constructions and extensions in the 1400s, but by the 1540s, it was in ruin. The palaces had defensive features as well, including crenellations, boundary walls, gatehouses, and moats. The moats in particular might have been largely picturesque, while crenellations were a display of power and of royal trust and support, because you could only crenellate if you had a license granted by the crown to do so. Carwood was the first of the Archbishop of York's residences to be crenellated, with a license granted in 1272. Now, this isn't from 1272, this building. This is a gatehouse from the mid-15th century, but it gives a sense of some of the kind of robust defensive looking features that the palaces had over the centuries. At Beverley, the manor house there is recorded. The archaeology has shown that it had a moat with a timber bridge, potentially a drawbridge, in the early 1300s. There's another manor of the archbishops of York at Bishop Wilton, near to Pocklington, which no physical signs of it today, but archaeology has shown that that was a significant site of 180 meters by 90 meters, all encircled by a moat 3 meters wide and 3 meters deep. Returning to the south for a moment, just to be able to illustrate an example of a bishop's palace with a moat remaining, this is Wells, where the license to crenellate was granted in 1341, and the moat was formed by diverting the natural springs in the gardens. So some of the defences of these castles would have been more picturesque, and ways of kind of showing off their connections with the crown and the wealth and importance of the bishops. But the history of the castles does show that they were needed on numerous occasions at several of the sites, in part because the bishops did go to war, like the kings did. So a prominent example of this is in Cumbria, at Rose Castle, which over many centuries was the principal residence of the bishops of Carlisle. So this was often under threat from the Scots, and it was sacked and burnt down twice in the early 14th century. Following these raids, the present building was constructed from the late 1330s by Bishop Kirkby there as a fully fortified castle. So it was built in a pentagonal form around 5 sides, with these big robust towers that one in its original form can be seen there on the right, and with a mantle wall all around it. The building that can be seen today has been kind of opened out and kind of romanticized a bit more, but this was definitely a proper fortified castle. Durham Castle as well, there's a plan of it here. It was fortified, unsurprisingly, given how powerful the bishops were and that they could raise their own personal armies as well. So it had the Motte and Bailey and massive towers with a curtain wall all around it. So that plan gives the sense of the kind of structure with the Motte over on the right-hand side. And then you can see the appearance of it as well there. In Yorkshire, the manor house at Otley is thought to have been destroyed or heavily damaged by the Scots when they ravaged Yorkshire in 1319, although it was rebuilt afterwards by a subsequent bishop. And then there was a manor house at Sherburn and Elmet as well, which had been a residence of the archbishop since the 10th century. That was destroyed in the same devastation by the Scots. Somewhat ironically, because it had actually been given to the archbishops in thanks by one of the Saxon kings for the support in fighting against the Scots and Scandinavians many centuries before. It seems that it was abandoned after the raids by the Scots, and then stone from the building was reportedly used in the building of the choir at York Minster. So none of that can be seen today either. Even the palaces that weren't in dangerous locations per se benefited from the existence of defensive structures at times of civil unrest. So I referred to the bishops being powerful men close to the crown and from families of great wealth. So they were sometimes at odds with the general population, including in the 14th century, when the poll taxes were going through and the bishops were in support of those, and many castles came under attack during that time by the peasants. They also had to fend off run-of-the-mill robbery. Both Bishop Thorpe and Carwood are recorded as having been broken into by robbers when the archbishop was away on his royal duties, taking property and threatening servants. In the post-medieval period, there became a little bit of settling down and less moving about, and some palaces being set aside, particularly during the Reformation. There were some sites taken over by the crown on a permanent and a temporary basis. So when the sites were taken over by the crown, not only did the residents go, but the manor and the lands associated with the manor alongside it, meaning that there was less income from the manors, which meant there was less money to be put into repairing and restoring the castles, which meant that the favoured ones started to gain a focus, and ones that were falling into disrepair started to be abandoned. So both Bishop Wilton and Bishop Burton in Yorkshire are understood to have been surrendered to Henry VIII, although they were then returned. An example of a bishop's palace that did end up permanently in the hands, removed from the bishops at that time, is Knowle Palace down in Surrey, which It had a very good deer garden, and Henry VIII liked hunting deer, so it's perhaps understandable why he decided to take that one. Then we move on to the Civil War. And this had a significant impact on the course of the history of many of the palaces as well. At least 19 major residences were severely damaged or completely ruined, while the bishops sided with the royalists, and then they came under attack from the parliamentarians. The parliamentarians often moved in, kind of ransacked. There was a fighting around them, leading to destruction or ruination. Auckland Castle is one example where the parliamentarians took over for some time. There's a survey that exists which described it as a very stately manor house when it was being advertised for sale to the parliamentarians. And that account records the two-story chapel, which was referred to earlier. So the parliamentarians, frequently when they moved in, they destroyed the defensive capabilities of castles. But here the new occupant destroyed the original chapel. And this seems to have been a clear statement against the church and the power of the prince bishops. When the bishops returned in the late original 12th century Great Hall, which I mentioned previously, was repurposed as the chapel. You can see it there on the right. The clerestory windows were added by Bishop Cousin, and then the interior was decked out, as can be seen on the right. Bishop Thorpe was also sold over to a parliamentarian, to Colonel Walter White. He moved in, and he basically moved into one wing and made that into a self-contained residence, leaving the rest of the castle to fall into ruin. When it was subsequently returned to the bishops, the first returning bishop accepted Fruin, restored the oldest part of the castle, and decked out the dining room or Great Hall, as can be seen here. When he moved in, it was reportedly in ruinous condition and open to the sky, but he restyled it as it appears now. So after this period, as well as we move into the Georgian and Victorian period, there was some extensive rebuildings and remodelings, including again at Bishop Thorpe, where Archbishop Richard Drummond commissioned Thomas Atkinson of York to undertake significant works. If people want to go and see some churches by Atkinson, one good example is the Grey True Star listed church of All Saints in Bransby, Steersby, close to Castle Howard. So the work at Bishop Thorpe is described in the relevant volume of Pevsner as delightful additions in the Gothic style, whereas an early 20th century account is less enamoured. It says that the alterations made by him were great improvements as far as convenience were concerned, but the taste of the period proved a hopeless drawback to any true artistic design or continuity in the construction of the new buildings. Indeed, the preservation of the old character of the house does not seem to have occurred to the architect, who preferred to adhere to the fashionable Strawberry Hill style of the age. And it reproduced a semblance of Gothic architecture entirely wanting in spirit. I'll let you be the judge, but the work included the new gatehouse and the refronting of the West Palace, which has hidden the earlier parts of the building. And it does, admittedly, drastically alter the first appearances of the castle. As he remodeled the front, he brought it forward as well to provide new rooms. In this period, there were several noted architects involved in works at bishops' palaces. Again, this was an indication that the bishops were still pretty important people, still with a fair amount of money that they could commission noted architects of the period. Ewan Christian, the church architect, is understood to have undertaken work at the chapel at Bishop Thorpe, and he also did some work at the castle next to Lincoln Cathedral. At Rose Castle, Thomas Rickman was brought in to modernise the buildings in the late 1830s. Rickman is of particular note for anyone interested in church architecture because he defined the categories that we use in describing the Gothic periods of English architecture, when he wrote an attempt to discriminate the styles of architecture in England from the Conquest to the Reformation. So the terms Norman, Early English, Decorated, and Perpendicular were all Thomas Rickman's creation. You can see here the chapel, which he redid, and he also redid the staterooms and the entrance hall. Again, if you're wanting to go visit an example of work by Rickman, you could make a trip to Rothwell near Leeds, which is Grade 2 style listed, built in 1827 to 29. At Auckland Castle, James Wyatt, the neoclassical and neo-Gothic architect who worked on numerous churches and Westminster Abbey, was brought in to remodel parts of the castle in the last decade of the 18th century. He reworked the entrance to the staterooms, applying Gothic decoration to the existing building. He inserted the imperial stair, which can be seen on the left here, and he divided the long chamber into an anteroom and a throne room, which can be seen on the right. It's suggested that work was undertaken by John Carr at Auckland Castle as well, but this doesn't seem to have been definitely attributed to him. That was prior to the work by James Wyatt. John Carr was a noted architect who was born and designed the church and is buried at Horbury near Wakefield, so Yorkshire born, bred and working. So this work was commissioned by Bishop Trevor and included the remodeling of the dining room. Plan can be seen here. And the remodeling of the dining room was done in part to accommodate the paintings which were acquired by Bishop Trevor by the Spanish painter Francisco de Zubarán, which depict the Jacob and his 12 sons. So he supported bills that increased the rights of Jewish people. And so this was a bit of a political statement he made there. Then more widely at Hartlebury, back down south, the chapel there is by Henry Keane, who worked on many churches. And this is particularly noted as being one of the most significant works of the Gothic revival, Gothic with a K revival. So there was still all this money going into Bishop's Palaces for quite a long time, but there was also wider change happening. So one thing that happened in the 1832, there was the Reform Bill passing through Parliament, which was going to increase the number of people who could vote, including spreading the right to vote to the working classes and reworking the constituencies to better reflect population growth in industrial areas. Almost all of the bishops were opposed to this, so they came under attack from the general population. And then there became an increasing recognition by the church that it had to do something to remove some of the inequalities that were inherent in the diocesan system and the wealth distribution and this disconnect of the church and the bishops with the general population. So one thing they did was to form the Ecclesiastical Commissioners in 1836, and they would introduce a fairer management of diocesan finances. So the residences at this time of the bishops stayed in the control of the diocese, but there started to be a refinement of them. Prior to this, there was also a bill that had been passed through Parliament, which enabled land and endowments to be surrendered. And the Bishop of Durham used the opportunity to vest Durham Castle in the University of Durham upon his death. So the ecclesiastical commissioners were largely responsible for reducing the number of palaces, but they did have to provide a few new residences because new dioceses were created from the larger dioceses in part to reflect population changes. And Ripon Palace is an example of one that was purpose-built, and this was done in 1836 by William Railton. If you want to see a church example of Railton's work, he's got several listed churches. Most of them are in Leicestershire, but within Yorkshire, there is All Saints at Meanwood, Leeds, built in 1849 and Grade 2 listed. He also contributed work to Ripon Cathedral. And then in 1943, new legislation came into force, which passed ownership of all the bishops' palaces to the church commissioners, as they were now called. So they would now be responsible for the maintenance, which would relieve financial pressure on the bishops, but also make for a fairer distribution of wealth. At this time, they undertook assessments of various of the bishops' palaces, and some of them came close to have the bishops to being deemed inappropriate for the bishops and in such poor condition that they couldn't be kept. Auckland Castle came under threat, Wells Palace came under threat, as did Hartlebury. There were objections from local population, from groups like the Society for the Protection of Ancient Building. And ultimately, many of these, the solution taken was to reduce the accommodation of the bishop to a part of the building and leave the rest open for the public. But still, by the time that review was finished by 1960, 19 of the residents had been replaced. In subsequent decades, people may be familiar that there have continued to be reviews of the bishops' palaces, famously Bishop Auckland, and those paintings which I mentioned. There was a moment where the church commissioners were talking about selling those off to kind of fund the running of the building, but then a solution came when a local lad who happened to have made good and made a lot of money bought them and bought the palace for the use by the public. So a lot of these palaces no longer occupied by the bishops anymore, but on the flip side, the positive side of that is there is an increased amount of public access, and us as simple members of the public can go and enjoy them. So that is where I end. Gone a little bit longer because of my technical glitch there, but I'm happy to take any questions.